But immediately what happens, Justice Champion, is what you said at the very beginning of the programme, is that the two-headed comes up again, because in Milton writes Iconoclastes, which is the emergence of the great Republican writer Milton attacking Icon Basilica and dismantling it. And
Iconoclastes, destroy the image. Yes. And there's a long tradition of Republican attacks on Icon Basilicae. I mean, as Claire's pointed out, this is an enormous bestseller. It's reprinted throughout the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. And Milton's tradition is one that says, this is idolatry. Not only that, it's probably plagiarized from Sidney's poems. Charles didn't even write it, and that's clearly something that comes out in the 1690s when the whole Republican experiment is remembered and redesigned. Again, Icon Basilicae, Charles's text, it has a perdurability of influence that is embodied in the image of the frontispiece, and that again manifests itself in social practice. All of the rumours and folklore about the healing power of Charles' blood, for example, or the little angels that you would get when you were touched by him, persist through this period into the 18th century. So we get the invention of a miraculous monarchy. So the irony again is, at the very moment when his head's chopped off, he invents an incredibly powerful, persistent tradition.
Let's just go a little bit further with Milton here, Tom Healy. Can you tell us the references, as it were, in Paradise Lost to this, to Charles I?
Well, taking up entirely on this idea of the false icon. That what Milton suggests is this model that monarchs, or earthly monarchs, can, and Charles particularly, can be fundamentally diabolical. That when Satan is thrown out of heaven and lands in hell, one of the first things he starts doing is building his city of Pandemonium, which has a lot of similarities to Charles's court. And so there is a strong presentation that what is happening in those who support Charles and create this image are of this diabolical camp. I mean, this is this great fracturing point in English society, in a way, is actually fighting using rather similar tools and similar ideas, but opposed to one another. So, to Milton's mind, this type of earthly monarchy goes back to this idea of excess. That one way that we can recognize its falsity is that it is unstable and excessive. It is involved in the city of man rather than the city of God. So it is against man. So it goes against this whole tradition. It's doing. It is not what Erasmus, in The Education of the Christian Prince, tries to outline as a Christian prince should do with his sense of moderation. So Charles is made, and the Stuart monarchy in its absolutism is made out to be excessive, given over to its own appetites, not interested in the health of the nation.
And yet in 1660, Charles II comes back, and the fact that he comes back seems to be a resurrection of the idea of divine right. He loves to touch for the king's evil. 100,000 people turn up. It's a great event after event. Eastertide is one of the great events in London, or indeed in European life, in these mass gatherings. We haven't, alas, much evidence for whether it worked or not. I don't say that sarcastically. We don't seem to have a great deal of evidence. But can I come to you on another point here, Claire Jackson? We've got the restoration, not only of Stuart monarchy, but of the idea of divine right, and at the same time we have a person such as Locke beginning a very clear attack on that. Can you tell us what Locke said?
Yes.
And that it's Locke made it very important.
And it's Locke actually very directly reacting towards these ideas. The first of the two treatises that's published in 1689 is very directly against a work called Patriarcha, published by Sir Robert Filmer. And certainly in the Restoration, as you say, the cult of divine monarchy flourishes as it's never flourished before. Robert Filmer's Patriarcha is published in 1680, while Filmer had died in 1653. He didn't get permission to publish Patriarcha during the Civil Wars because it was seen as more royalist than the king, if you like. It was too extreme. And the reason that Locke chooses it as the target for the two treatises, the first of the two treatises that he's writing at the beginning of the 1680s, is because he says this is the current divinity of the times. What Filmer does is draw a very direct parallel, moves away from a traditional mode of arguing for divine right monarchy, of using primarily scriptural texts, to actually move on to a much more naturalistic territory and say, actually, Genesis gives us the evidence that kings are the fathers of their people. It's totally fallacious to say that people are born free. Everybody's born in subjection. Everybody's born into families, and the obedience that people owe to their fathers is exactly the same as is owed to their kings. And Locke draws a very clear distinction between James's writings on kingship. He calls him that most wise king who well understood the notion of things, as opposed to this very thoroughgoing naturalistic argument that actually then does develop into or could be extended into a theory of sovereignty to say that kings must be above the law. And Locke very deliberately collapses the distinction between absolute and arbitrary power that James had worked so hard to reinforce at the beginning of the 17th century. James had told, in Basilicon Doron, James had told his heir that the only way you'll understand what a king is to know what a tyrant is, and you need to keep those two in a sort of mutual antithesis. And Locke immediately just collapses it and says this is absolute arbitrary power. It's fallacious to say that people are born in subjection. Actually, men are born free. They have inalienable rights. Government is a construct. Kings are appointed for particular offices, and if they fail, then individuals have a right of resistance. And that argument really kind of begins to move the whole debate away from particular texts of scripture onto a much more naturalistic, utilitarian basis.
It's quite interesting, though, Claire, isn't it, that many of the sort of conceptual arguments that Locke puts together there as an antidote to divine right monarchy can actually be seen being rehearsed earlier in those Catholic theorists who are opposed to Protestant divine right theories. So we've got, again, a counterintuitive importation of continental ideas that have already existed.
And I think what one then therefore sees is the interplay of practice and politics. I mean, I think the reason that the Catholic arguments have so much, it can be discredited at the beginning of the century, are because of things like the Gunpowder Plot, and then they immediately come back onto the stage again in the late 1680s.
But the irony is, of course, that Locke writing against Charles II is because he thinks he's popish, he's Catholic,
absolutely.
but he's exploiting, he's exploiting Catholic ideas.
So we've brought in Locke just a little, but we have introduced him into conversation. Is the literature still tackling this idea in any significant way, Tom?
Yes. Marvell, who similarly has this equation between arbitrary power and popery and writes a tract on it, also writes a striking poem called Last Instructions to a Painter, in which he marks out really the excesses which are taking place in court and particularly the sexual excesses, as being instrumental of the failure of the English state to defend itself in the Dutch wars. That really this excess coming from the monarchy and from the top is really responsible for the failure of the nation. The nation is rendered vulnerable. And there's an astonishingly striking image at the heart of this, where England, naked and dishevelled, having been battered around by all these evil king's counsellors and so forth, comes to the monarch in the dead of night and seeks for succour, for help.
England in the shape of
a naked woman, dishevelled, and comes penitent to the king, asking to be restored, and the king rapes her. But what is most unsettling about this is that Marvell suggests that the king finds her very distressed condition the act which causes his arousal. And this is the most telling instance that the monarch is really working against the state itself, or against the spirit, the whole nation itself. The monarch is actually finding the collapse of the nation that's in its unhealthy, in its distressed state, attractive to commit rapine on. I mean, this satanic image is really very, very powerful and very distasteful, as it's supposed to be.
Was it the accession of James II with his Catholic tendency and the Glorious Revolution? William Orange came in and refused to have anything to do with this. A reasoning Dutch person. Did that mark the end of it, or had ideas driven it out?
I think that's a very tricky question. I mean, the theological premises of society persist right the way through the 18th and perhaps into the 19th century. I mean, the confessional basis of political citizenship is there until 1828. If you're Catholic, you can't be a good citizen. Clearly, by the end of the 17th century, though, the sorts of instincts, the great statement, no bishop, no king, the Church of England is pretty much disestablished in 1689, so that the sort of sacral dimensions of the monarchy are also undercut. We need perhaps to remember that the rise of science is key here, and even if we took something like the Royal Touch from the 1660s, physicians associated with the Royal Society start asking questions. How does a Royal Touch work? Well, perhaps there are natural causes. So it demystifies, disenchants monarchy.
And the Royal Touch is very much the outward manifestation of the inner divinity.
William Orange won't have anything to do with it.
He doesn't want any royal touching. No. Finally, Claire, do you see the Glorious Revolution? You see William of Orange as bringing it to an effective end?
Well, no, I think what's very interesting about the way in which resistance to James occurs is that the emphasis on non-resistance is very important. Everyone's very keen to distance themselves from any notion that James actually abdicated. None of us really resisted anymore. And I think retrospectively, the divine right of kings does acquire this dignity. I mean, it did save England from descending into some sort of popish network of inquisitorial jurisdictions. It did sort of save us all being in some sort of Presbyterian theocracy. And it also sort of identifies probably a non-utilitarian attachment to government. That perhaps Burke picks up in the late 18th century, that you can't just judge government purely on how good it is, that there has to be a sort of more emotive affection. I think that does reside through the 18th and into the 19th centuries.
I think one of the other things we should perhaps emphasise is the republican tradition continues in the 17th and into the 18th century, but it's a republicanism that takes the institution of a virtuous monarchy at its core. That sounds very counterintuitive and paradoxical, but even republicans recognise in the 18th century, in England, a Protestant monarchy is the best bulwark against continental popery.
Well, thank you very much, Claire Jackson, Justin Champion, Tom Healy. For me,